Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today, we're jumping back into our journey through the Revelation to John. In the last volume, we encountered the Angel of the Abyss, a being described as a star that fell down to Earth from the heavens. And this being used a key to unlock the shaft that leads to the endless deep. And out of this abyss came smoke that darkened the sky and blotted out the sun and moon. And the Angel of the Abyss released a swarm of locusts from deep under the earth. And these locust creatures are, of course, exactly the kind of thing you encounter in nightmares. Something that's very hard to describe. And as we saw in the last volume, John is trying very hard to describe in words what he is seeing. And as a result, these creatures that are very hard to describe are also hard for us to forget. Especially given the bizarre circumstance where they are not allowed to actually outright kill anyone. Their whole purpose is to inflict pain. So I don't know about you, but I think I'm ready to hear a little bit more about these locusts. I have a feeling that they're not like normal locusts. I have a feeling that as John describes them, we're going to begin to wonder why he used the word locust to describe something that is clearly not a locust. But I have the feeling that John is struggling to find the right words for what he's seeing, so let's bear with him, and let's hear his description of these things that came out of the smoke.
These locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. They had what looked like golden crowns on their heads, and their faces were like the faces of humans, with hair like women. They had teeth like lions, and they wore armor like iron breastplates. And their wings made the noise of chariots drawn by many charging horses. Their tails were like scorpions' tails, with stingers that could torture people for 5 months. As their leader, they had their emperor, the Angel of the Abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollyon. That was the first of the disasters. There are still 2 more to come.
Okay. Well, John is saying that these locusts look like horses prepared for battle. So I think it's clear that he's not seeing locusts and he's not seeing horses. And he knows that. Now, these beings don't seem to be people either, even though he says they have the faces of humans and hair like women. As far as the hair like women, he just says trichas, hair, hos, just like, trichas gynaikon, which means like the hair of women. Gynaikon would be transliterated Gynaikon. That Gyn should tip you off to let you know we're talking about the ancient Greek word for a woman, And based on any consideration of Greco-Roman culture in the late 1st century AD, the only thing we can say is that having hair like a woman just meant it was long. Now, if this were Homer, everybody had long hair, men and women. However, after Alexander, and especially after Caesar, in the early Roman imperial period, it became a thing for a man of status and wealth, a citizen in particular, to keep his hair short, because it was kind of expensive to keep your hair short. In the days before safety razors, and the days even before good straight razors, getting yourself clean shaven was a bit of a chore. It was hard to do, and you usually needed the help of a professional. So being clean-shaven was a mark of high social status and wealth, where, of course, now it's not. It's almost the reverse. You show high status by being able to dress poorly at your job, and no one can really do anything about it. That's one way to show your status now. We have a strange culture. However, it was the case that plenty of lower-class people and foreigners, especially your wild barbarian men, wore their hair long, so saying that these beings had long hair might be an indication that they are from the East, that they are barbarian invaders of some kind. Now, about these wings making noises like chariots. I'm sure some of you heard my clever insertion of helicopter noises into the cacophony there in the last clip. This is simply because when I was going through the internet looking for samples of sound clips of locusts and swarms of locusts, I found recordings of giant locusts and flying beetles, basically insects that have a similar structure, have similar wings to a locust, but they're just larger and more massive. And what do you know? They definitely have a helicopter-type sound. And once the bugs start to get big enough and numerous enough, you can just run the experiment yourself in Audacity, and it becomes hard to tell the difference between a helicopter blade sound and a giant bug. And I just couldn't help but wonder if there's some connection there. Because you could argue that John is struggling very hard to describe a military helicopter, or a group of military helicopters. Because someone from the late 1st century AD, seeing that image in their mind, I think they would probably struggle just like John to describe in words what they're seeing and hearing. But we do know that it's not good, especially because of the words that come into John's head when he's seeing this. Now, he says that these creatures that could torture people had a leader, and of course it's implied that their leader is the person who released them, and we know that that is a being that is closely associated with Satan. And here, they're given another name, the Angel of the Abyss. And that makes sense because we know that in terms of what kind of being Satan is, he's classified as an angel. Whatever kind of being the angels are, that's also what Satan and the demons are. And we are another class because we have a physical form that angel beings don't. It's interesting because this Hebrew word Abaddon and the Greek Apollyon are words that seem to be referring to the abyss, because abad in Hebrew apparently means destruction or perishing or disintegration. And so Abaddon would be a place where that happens, the place where the disintegration and the perishing happens. And so it's referring to this terrible place that has been opened up in the previous passage. Now, about the Greek word Apollyon. One thing that's interesting is to see the Greek god Apollo be discussed and depicted in medieval art as a kind of a young, attractive, boyish man who likes to play the lute. And he's generally represented that way because he was supposedly a beautiful aristocratic figure, and he was associated with music and the upper classes. However, the word Apollo basically means destroyer. Apolluein in Greek would be to destroy something. And in Homer, we see Apollo firing arrows into a camp to start a plague among those people. And so Apollo was associated with plagues, which, as we talked about in a previous episode, in the absence of germ theory, ancient people just sort of thought of plagues as just death that came for you. And so Apollo was always a scary deity who was always ready to destroy people en masse. And so it's not surprising at all that we see that name and that Greek word associated with this abyss. So, things are pretty bad now, but this passage reminds us that we've got 2 more disasters to come. And so, gosh, what is the 6th trumpet going to bring? What's going to happen next?
The 6th angel blew his trumpet. And I heard a single voice coming from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God. The voice said to the 6th angel who held the trumpet, "Unleash the 4 angels who are chained to the great river Euphrates." Those 4 angels have been preparing for this very hour, of this day, of this month, of this year. Ready to kill 1/3 of all humans. I heard the size of their army. The number of their cavalry was 2 times 10,000 times 10,000 horsemen.
Okay, lots to unpack here. So first we have a voice coming from 4 horns that are on the altar before God. Once again, that's a very straightforward translation. Tessaron keraton. That keraton refers to the material that antlers or horns are made of. And once scientists found out that hair and fur and nails and feathers and antlers and horns are made of different versions of the same protein, they called that protein keratin. And it turns out that the corneas of your eyes, your eye lenses, your eyelashes, eyebrows, body hair, and the hair on your head are all made of a different kind of layering of different versions of this really important protein called keratin. These 4 horns ordered the 6th angel to blow a trumpet that unleashed 4 other angels that were bound to the river Euphrates. That's interesting. It's interesting that these 4 angels have armies, but maybe we should consider what the word angel means again. So, Angelos is just the Greek word for messenger or herald or agent. And so there is some semantic flexibility here where perhaps angel, angelos, here refers to 4 humans or 4 groups of humans who are going to do this particular task on behalf of God, or people who deliver a message for God. And if they do that in a poetic or metaphorical sense, then they are angels. And so, what 4 humans or groups of humans have been necessarily attached, connected, or bound to the Euphrates River for some long period of time? Now, unfortunately, that covers a huge number of candidates. The Euphrates River is in what is now Iraq, and Iraq used to be called Mesopotamia, the area between the 2 rivers. That's what it means in Greek. And the Euphrates was one of those rivers. The other one was the Tigris, the Tigris. And so the list of candidates for what could represent these 4 angels goes all the way back to the dawn of human civilization. And John uses the term hippiku for cavalry. And you can probably tell from the sound that I chose that I think John might be referring to cavalry as being the piloted locust creatures whose wings make that strange sound. However, that's a choice that I made, I freely admit. I have less apology for the choices I made regarding the angels that were chained to the Euphrates. Because I represented them as sort of frightening beasts with a mindless mission to kill. And I didn't make that up. That's pretty much what John said. Once again, the Bible is shouting from the rooftops that angels are terrifying beings, people. We all get raised on this idea of angels as being comforting or beautiful, with the high point, or the low point maybe, of this being the Renaissance portrayal of angels as babies with wings and lutes, floating blissfully on clouds. Here we have a good example of angels in the Bible being quite different. As we can see, these are not babies with lutes and wings that are being chained to the river, waiting to be let loose to kill humans. As you can see, the Bible goes a different direction than the Renaissance artists. Now, why am I so ready to be so flexible with this definition of cavalry? I seem to be playing fast and loose with these sounds, and I seem to be assuming these locust things have actual riders, and that John's vision really involves some sort of military vehicle. When you look at what John is really actually saying, they do seem to be some sort of chimera or human, mechanical, alien monster beast type thing. However, let's let John talk a little bit more about what these things are like and what he sees them doing. And maybe we'll see that I might have some justification for pushing the military vehicle interpretation. Let's see.
And in the vision, I saw the horses and their riders, who had armored breastplates that were red like fire, blue like hyacinth, and yellow like sulfur. The horses had heads like lions' heads, and their mouths were spewing fire, smoke, and sulfur. And these 3 weapons were used to kill a third of all humans. All of the horses' power was in their mouths and their tails. Their tails were like snakes. And the heads of those snakes could do harm.
I think it's interesting that for the first time, John uses the word vision to describe what's happening. Inte horase, which is just the Greek word for something you see in your head. Could be used for a dream or a hallucination. And so in this vision, John goes on to describe that these locust horses have riders, and that the riders have armored breastplates. And he describes the colors. And a lot of people have looked at, well, what countries have flags with those three colors? Fire red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. It's interesting because the blue and yellow bands certainly indicate the Ukrainian flag, and we all know that there are problematic nation states with red flags, so not sure what that means. But we do know that these armored riders are riding these flying locust horse things that have heads that look like lions' heads. And those lions' heads have mouths that are spewing this fire, smoke, and sulfur. And so this fire, smoke, and sulfur are a kind of weapon that was used to kill humans. So what's going on here? The word for spewing the fire, smoke, and sulfur, ekporeuetai, refers to something gushing out, pouring out, or being sprayed out. So these things are spewing out this fire, this smoke, this gas. It's some kind of material that hurts people, and it seems to be in a gaseous form. Once again, we run into the Greek word for plague just referring to a deadly attack, because it says these three weapons were used to kill, and the Greek refers to them as plegon for the word weapons. So you might be tempted to translate this as these three plagues were used to kill a third of all humans. However, the problem there is, for a modern reader, when you put the word plague in there, they start thinking about germ theory. They start thinking about, oh, they were killed by a microorganism. Well, John would not have known about that distinction. And so when he says plague, he just means something that kills people, not necessarily a microorganism. Now, as far as these locust, horse, helicopter, gas-spewing devices also having snake-like tails, I don't really know what to make of that, other than to say that this might be another reference to the non-lethal attacks that these devices can mount on humans. Because earlier we talked about the fact that they weren't able to kill certain people, and that their mission was to torture people for 5 months. And these snake tails seem to be another device that can contribute to the torturing. So what is the response from humans to all this? During these 5 months, after these impacts occur, after so many people have died, do people start to wake up? Do they realize what's happening to them? Do they change their ways? Do they decide, wow, I guess our way of life is a sort of a dead end and we should change? Well, I think you can probably guess. Humans are pretty stuck in their ways. I don't think they're gonna change. But who knows? Maybe they will. Maybe John's vision overall is gonna be a hopeful one. where humans figure out that they've gone on the wrong track, and we really need to pull together and improve ourselves and make a better future. Maybe that's what's going to happen. Let's see. It's not too late. I'm an optimist.
And the humans who were left behind, those who survived these attacks, still did not reconsider and did not change their ways. They continued to worship demons and idols made of gold, silver, bronze, wood, or stone. Things that cannot see or hear or walk around. They refused to give up their murdering and their witchcraft and their fornication and all their stealing.
Wow. Okay. So it looks like people are gonna continue to be stubborn, set in their ways, even during the end times. And all of this implies more of what I saw and touched on earlier. And it all boils down to the Greek verb dei. John says that he is being told that these things must happen. These aren't things that will happen. They're not God's attack plan on mankind, but they're being represented here as a kind of natural consequence of something. And this passage heavily implies, as does the entirety of all the previous books of the Bible, that this something is human behavior and the not so great elements of human behavior. And here at the end of chapter 9, John closes by putting all of the blame for this right at the feet of humans. It's even implied here that if this remaining 2/3 of humans were to reform its ways en masse, then no more trumpets would have to be blown. And so let's talk about these particular foibles or human weaknesses that John is pointing out here at the end of chapter 9. First, he talked about the worshiping of demons and idols. This is a pretty broad statement because, as we know, the early Christians began to see all pagan worship as worshiping demons. Daimon in ancient Greek just meant a lesser deity, something like the little spirit that inhabits this part of the woodlands, and we give it a honey cake on this day in this ceremony to placate the spirit. Well, the Christians would say, dude, you're being tricked. That's a demon. Also, we're all familiar with that big division between the Abrahamic religions and the other pagan Mediterranean pre-Christian traditions that were obsessed with representing their deities visually in stone or other materials, where in the Abrahamic religion, with some notable exception in certain forms of Christianity, but in Judaism and later in Islam, there is this turning away from physical representations. And it's linked to this idea that their God is beyond the constraints of the material world. And that to depict God as having hands and a head and eyes that only see from one place and can only be in one place at a time is inaccurate and limiting in a lot of ways. You see this verbal attack a lot in Christian writing when they are criticizing the pre-Christian point of view. The Christian writers will point out that, you guys are making these gigantic statues at great expense, and you seem to think they're very important, but they're just rocks or lumps of metal. In other words, they can't hear or see anything. And it's sort of a kind of silliness. You're pretending that the God is there. And the early Christians were like, our God is everywhere, but you can't see them. And so that's how we will represent him. Now, the next sin that John talks about is murder. I think there's some broad agreement in our culture that murder is wrong in general, and that the less of it you have, the better. Unfortunately, there's not as much agreement on that as we'd like. But at the very least, I don't think that we need to talk about it much because it's pretty clear. Then there is witchcraft. That's a little less clear. We just need to know that John would consider reading your horoscope as participating in witchcraft. And so, don't think you're getting away with it. And then there's the word that I translated as fornication. It's interesting because I actually didn't really need to even translate it. I've run this experiment where I just said the ancient Greek word to people and they knew exactly what I was talking about. So, John doesn't say fornication, he says porneia, which would be transliterated Porneia. Porneia. So what is porneia? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like, just minus the digital imagery and the internet. One way you could translate it is basically participating in sex work. So basically, if a man was paying for it, or if he was with a woman that was not his wife, and she was attached to him because of his wealth or social status, then that was porneia. And if a woman was, working at a brothel and being paid money for the act, or if she was unmarried and attaching herself to one high-status man after another for financial support, that would also be considered porneia. Because remember, coins were not used as often as depicted in the movies and whatnot. It was very much a barter economy. The woman working for cash in the brothels, that was, as you might imagine, a fate that women sought to avoid. And so one goal for a woman who didn't want to end up as somebody's wife was to become, something of what we would call an independent concubine. In Greek, the word was hetaira. Hetaira is more like a companion. Of course, in feudal Japan, you famously had the women called geisha. And these were similar. They're basically professional girlfriends of upper-class men. And so a lot of women sought that role. But of course, John would say, nope, no good. You are supposed to become someone's wife. Now, John also mentions theft. And I think it's interesting that John mentions 4 kinds of crimes or sins in his mind, 2 of which, in his world, he could have sought legal recourse for in some cases. There were some kinds of murder and theft that were illegal under Roman law. But also bear in mind that John would have considered a lot of what the Roman government did to be murder. And John would have considered a lot of what the Roman nobility did and what the Roman administrators did to be theft. So I think it's important to point out that John is not talking about crimes, really. Everything he's railing about is, in large part, legal. The kind of witchcraft that he's talking about, in some cases, is actually funded and propagated by the Roman state. And of the fornication that he's talking about, of course, the sexual mores of the people outside of the Abrahamic tradition at the time were seen as wild libertines with uncontrollable lust. And so I bring this up to point out that John could not care less about the law, about Roman law, about the secular rules of the time. You can see that he doesn't judge things by that at all. In fact, to him, the secular laws are often perverse and evil. And he shared that view with most early Christians. And so this is very different from, say, Confucius's attitude, or the attitude of a Roman noble, where they're looking at the world and saying, oh my gosh, there's not enough law and order. People need to follow the program. We got to get people on board with things and get them obeying the law. Well, John would say, no, we need more people disobeying the law. We got to bring this whole thing down because the entire system is evil from top to bottom. It's only a kind of wild, individualized, rebellious movement of people bringing sort of true virtue back into the world. And that's sort of what John is hoping for, and that is how he is seeing this resolution of all the terrible things that are happening in the book of Revelation. John is seeing this as the only possible way to bring Earth back to its original virtue. Well, that's it for Chapter 9, and I think that's a good stopping point for today. We'll continue with Chapter 10 in the next volume of our journey through the Revelation to John. But this was a weird one. This is kind of known for being difficult to piece together what's happening. I always remember it as the one about the abyss and those insect vehicle monster things. That keeps it all clear in my head. So, maybe, just maybe, starting in Chapter 10, there's no more death and destruction. Maybe there's no more weird, upsetting imagery, and everything works out okay. Maybe people turn away from their poor behavior, and things work out in a miraculous and beautiful way. And everybody lives in happiness and health for the rest of their days. And so I'm sure you know that that's unfortunately not the case. It only gets worse and weirder. Humans are fated to end up this way. They don't repent. And so in the next volume, we'll see what happens when the seventh and final angel blows their trumpet. Surely it's going to work out exactly like we would expect. So until next time, let's try to keep the murdering and the theft and the fornication and the idolatry to a minimum. You never know when strange things are going to just start falling out of the sky. But until then, be careful. I'll talk to you later.
King James Power feels so right.